With your media connections and all that good stuff, I imagine that you've got some coverage of this book coming up from your old buddies, or have all your contacts faded away?
Well, no, but AP stopped reviewing books last month, so they're not doing that anymore. But I've got
Yeah.
some good, I've got some good media hits and have done a bunch of stuff, and
Yeah.
there's more in the pipeline. So you know how it is.
I
I
know
mean,
how it
it's
is.
oh my God, it wasn't it enough that we wrote the darn book, and then
No,
we
apparently not. Hey, let me introduce you properly here,
sure,
and we'll get this thing going.
okay,
This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is William J. Kole. And William, or Bill, as we will call him from now on, is a veteran journalist and acclaimed ex-foreign correspondent who has reported from North America, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. As Vienna bureau chief for the Associated Press, that would be AP to most people, he wrote extensively on the nexus of crime, the weapons trade, arms trafficking, and terrorism across Eastern Europe. He is the author of In Guns We Trust. We're going to be talking about that. The Unholy Trinity of White Evangelicals, Politics, and Firearms. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and please subscribe right now on YouTube, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you can also follow my new project at thegospelofzip.com, which launches November 1, both on YouTube as a 7 hour and 15-minute read aloud free book for all of you people, and also for sale then where books are for sale at the same time. But today we're talking about In Guns We Trust. And the first thing I want to show you, Bill, is that not only did I read this hard copy, but if you can see the dog-eared book pages, every single one
okay.
of those dog ears is a note. Every single note is a question. This would be a typical page. Chapter 6, Gunmakers for God. Take a look at the page. So when I prepare for a book, I am
Okay.
the only interviewer who will actually read the book. Not that I have a dim view of other interviewers, but I really read it. And so when I say I love this book and I want to, part of my book club, we're making it a January offering. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read, that goes with my commentary page. It has to be said, and we do not do all the books we interview authors on, only ones we feel are really important. And yours, sadly, is ripped from the headlines. And
Right.
so we're going to talk about this book at length. And what I did to start with is I kind of pretend I'm the publisher, um, and I do something publishers could do and sometimes don't, and that is I chose some quotes from the book that I think set it up, and would be, if I was doing a blurb, I'm going to start by reading the bits that um, I would put together as one passage if I was doing that. And I write on the top here, see, you can see I've written open. I don't know if you can see it.
I can
And
see it.
then and then I'll have to skip about a good bit. So bear with me. Here's my open. I identified as an evangelical for 3.5 decades, and for years I had no idea that gun ownership among evangelicals is more than 4 times higher than among some of those who adhere to other major faith traditions. 41% of white conservative Christians own a gun, the Pew analysis finds, compared to 1 in 10 Jews and Muslims in this country, and fewer than 1 in 3 people across the general population. And then my little note says, go to page 17. So I'm going to do it because I told myself to. And on page 17, I'll continue with this. And just as white evangelicals' fierce defense of the Second Amendment right to bear arms has made them indispensable to the NRA, it has endeared Donald Trump to them. And now to page 26, to continue my little excerpt here, to open the book, to give people a sense and a flavor of it. Bottom line, America is a virtual armory sitting atop a powder keg of Christian nationalism. And now to page 3031, to continue. Um, and by the way, when I read on Kindle, I'd have all this neatly in a file, but I think it's sort of, in terms of like impressing authors, the fact I'm paging through your book pleases your heart. So I'll do that.
It does
In the,
indeed.
yeah, in the chapters that follow, we'll explore why believers traded pacifism for pistols when they came to view the Second Amendment as God breathed, and how some evangelicals are even using shooting ranges to share their beliefs and grow their churches. I love the story you had in one about somebody who put a shooting range in the back of the church and they sort of combine it with Bible studies, which I think is pretty interesting. So anyway, that's kind of how I wanted to introduce the book by just showing people a little flavor of it. But the first thing I want to ask you is just to declare who you are. When people ask me who I am, I tend to say, well, maybe I'm a writer, but if you really want to know who I am, I'm somebody who's done childcare for three of my youngest grandchildren for the last 17 years who live across the street from me. And I also write books. And when you ask about my evangelical background, I say, well, it's very complex. And I describe myself as an atheist who prays. In other words, conflicted and uncertain about things. And that comes from my background. So before we get going, I'm kind of interested that it seems to me that you're kind of like my friend Tim Alberta, who wrote a book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And I was interested when I interviewed Tim, to find that he was a passionate, believing evangelical himself, but really criticizing the Trump phenomena from the point of view of the pastors he had talked to, who tended to be less right wing than their people, and they were getting bullied into supporting Trump otherwise or else. They'd be kicked out of their churches or whatever. And
Yeah.
you talk about French and some of these other writers in the Atlantic and other places, some of whom we've interviewed. But I'm curious because people need to know where you're coming from. Unless I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're writing In Guns We Trust as a Christian. You're not on the outside of the movement. You're not part of the ex-evangelical movement that sometimes people identify me with. So talk about that a little bit in terms of your own faith journey, because you're a critic of the gun rights or gun movement within evangelicalism, but you're writing from the inside track. You're not an outsider doing an article on people you don't know anything about. This is, they represent you. How did that fit in with your whole career in the AP and all the rest of it? I know you talk a little biographically in the book about your own journey toward faith, but give us a thumbnail.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess if I had to, describe myself to your listeners and viewers, I would just say I'm a journalist through and through. I
Yeah.
remember I had pastors who would make a big deal out of saying, we are not what we do. Well,
Mhm.
guess what? I am what I do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Journalism is kind of a calling, as for me anyway, as high a calling as anything else could be.
Yeah.
And the quest for truth and justice and all of that is very noble, and it grabbed me hard as a young man, and I've done this work all my life. So I am a journalist. I am an ex-evangelical actually now.
Mhm. Mhm.
I really, I kind of started to distance myself from evangelicalism because of I couldn't suffer the stances that the movement took on
Sure.
LGBTQ human beings, on
Yes.
migrants, these
Yeah.
beautiful people. I worked outside the United States as a foreign correspondent for a third of my life, and
Yeah.
I just can't with evangelicals and migrants
Yeah.
and the poor and people of color, and the list goes on and on. So I was already on tenuous ground with my own faith tribe
Sure.
when guns kind of was the last straw. It seems to me, Frank, and I've been talking to this with some friends recently. If you identify as a person of faith,
Right.
increasingly it feels to me like you ought to take the religious equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah.
Above all, do no harm,
Yeah.
And I don't see evangelicals in 2025 doing any such thing. I feel
Yeah.
like my people, and I still feel like I still love them. They're still
Yeah.
my brothers and sisters. They seem determined to be on the wrong side of history,
Yeah.
and this guns thing is just absolutely the wrong side of history.
Absolutely. Yeah, kind of a final straw. This is not in your book, but once in a while you have a sort of a moment of clarity where you're saying something comes up in which there is no wiggle room, and it's very much related to your book. Once when Kirk was shot, the one thing I never heard
Yeah,
from anybody on the right at all was any question about how the guy got his gun or whether that was a good
yeah,
thing. It was assumed, no, of course, that's fine. So let's not talk about that. And of course, that happens with every single tragedy. Let's not talk about the gun. It's a mental patient or whatever. But then that's not my moment of clarity. At the memorial service, one of those things where you're just saying, wow, this has gone a long way. When his widow stands up and says, I forgive the person who shot him, and does the thing that in my childhood as a believing evangelical being raised in a mission 70 years ago would have seemed, yeah, this is the right thing to do. Jesus says we're supposed to forgive. And 10 seconds later, on the same platform, to her face, Donald Trump says, yeah, but I hate my enemies. And that's the way I see it. Now, there's so much in the history of the move to the right of the evangelicals and what you talk about in Guns We Trust and so forth and so on. But it's rare you have almost an Orwellian moment of clarity where the two things are there right on the page. Not, they didn't happen a day later. It's right here. So one
Right.
person's saying, I'm a Christian, and so I forgive my husband's killer. And I'm not commenting on her sincerity or lack thereof or any politics about this at all. But in her face, someone turns to her, the president of the United States, and says, yeah, but I hate my enemies. Um, and the strange thing is, if you're not in the evangelical world and you weren't raised as I was by the parents I had, this might just go over your head in the same way that if you're a white person strolling down a street and you hear the N word somewhere, it goes over your head. But if you're a Black American who's suffered hearing that at a traffic stop, it's going to hit you different. And when I heard him stand up and say, yeah, but for me, it's not about forgiving your enemies. You hate your enemies. I hate my enemies. And that moment was sort of a choice. And I was thinking, if you had been raised as an evangelical, in that moment, you would either say, I've changed the definition of what it means to be a Christian if I can go with this. Or it would
Right.
call you back and you'd say, wow, a line has been crossed here that maybe the secular media won't notice, maybe people out of our environment won't notice. But, you talk about Billy Graham and how he opened the door to some of the right wing stuff with his anti communism and Nixon and so forth. But in the day, Billy and any evangelical would have been on the side of the person, at least publicly saying they forgive, whether they did that themselves or not. So
Right.
I don't know. I
Absolutely.
just throw that in to start this discussion because I think one of the things that is brilliant about In Gods We Trust is within the story of guns and evangelicals, you also chart their journey away from the centrality of Christ's teaching into really a completely different religion, centering around the ownership of a firearm and having a gun range in a church. So that
Yeah.
um, I look for this little story that's not in your book as a kind of a point of departure to discuss the overarching theme of your book. And then we're going to get into all these pages I've marked and the actual story of your book. So first, just go there for a minute because you're old enough to know, and as a journalist, you have been tracking many, many things. Let's first just talk about how far the white evangelical male believing church has gone in what they profess to be true when it comes to not just guns, but revenge, violence, killing, and all this other stuff. And I never would have predicted this 50 years ago. If you'd told me we'd be having this conversation, I'd be saying, well, they'd never go there. Of course not, because then you couldn't call yourself a Christian anymore.
Well, I don't know how they call themselves Christians, Frank, honestly. I mean, it is so astonishing to me the pivot away from the Prince of Peace and
Yeah,
all the, and the, look, you know, people will cherry pick the Bible and hang an
mm,
entire firearms theology upon one or two
sure.
verses, and they do that, of course. But if you objectively, I don't even care if you're an atheist, if you're a
Yeah,
committed believer, a Jesus follower, read the Bible objectively. Jesus Christ is a nonviolent figure, full
right,
stop. And
right,
there's absolutely no way around that. And
right.
anyone who tells you differently is wrong,
Yeah,
and so there's a it's become so grotesque. It's like it's a funhouse mirror distortion of Jesus Christ now that we
yeah,
see, right? Where um, and I don't even recognize my faith anymore or the faith tradition that I
yeah.
latched onto at the end of university when I fell in quite by accident with a happy band of young evangelicals and thought I had found my tribe. I
Which you
really
have in
feel,
the book, by the way. You have that
yeah,
story in the book.
right. But I just feel like this hard pivot away from simple, pure biblical truths about
Yeah.
who God is, to me, it all adds up to kind of a betrayal.
Yeah.
because if I had known that this was where evangelical Christianity was heading, I
Yeah.
never would have, I never would have touched it, and I regret honestly the time and treasure. I spent 35 years
Yeah.
in evangelical Christianity with, also serving as a lay missionary for 3 years and
Yeah.
serving as a megachurch worship leader and
Yeah.
as a deacon and all these other things. I really have a hard time even recognizing this Rambo Jesus
Yeah, it's impossible. And the thing
whom,
is, again, if you're not raised in that tradition or were part of it as you were coming in as a convert, the impact of what we're saying would be lost on some people. They wouldn't get it.
right.
Um, but what we do. So I want to talk about in God's we trust, in God, in guns we trust, not God. See, slip there. I thought it used to be God. It
It used to be, Frank.
used to be, but it isn't now. Um, I identified as an evangelical for 3.5 decades, which you've just talked about. And for years, I had no idea that gun ownership among evangelicals is more than 4 times higher than among some of those who adhere to other major faith traditions. So, right there is something that let's discuss just the trajectory of that. I don't think that was always the case. It is now, but I'm not sure that 50 years ago, there were 4 times more white evangelicals owning guns than anybody else. I would have thought that it would be a more even spread. Do you want to just comment on that, how that's
Sure.
changed?
Yeah, well, it has changed a lot, but so has you know, I mean, a lot of aspects of political
Sure.
uh, awareness and just taking stands on things. I mean, look, back when I became a Christian in the early
Mm.
'80s,
Yeah.
I think it to some degree, well, it was a little bit before in the '70s, Christians were starting to get worked up about abortion.
Yeah.
Prior to that, Christians didn't talk about abortion.
Well,
It
or
really
any
wasn't,
political moral litmus
or
test,
any,
as in that
right.
and there were evangelicals who were conservative who would sometimes vote Democrat.
That's right. Absolutely. And that happened a lot.
Yeah.
Before we fractured into these, these echo chambers that we can't
Sure.
seem to climb out of. But, look, it just didn't happen. And guns were not part of the church. And the church was very, very committed to nonviolence and pacifism. Even my
Absolutely.
my my evangelical denomination, the one that I served as a missionary with, the Assemblies of God,
Yeah.
a Pentecostal denomination, one of the bigger ones in the United States and
Yes.
actually around the world, was officially pacifist until
Yeah,
the late
absolutely.
60s. It was in
Yeah.
their constitution and bylaws,
Yeah.
and of course they've taken a hard tilt to the
A very
right.
hard tilt.
And,
One of the things I just want to point out to people who are thinking about your book, In God, Guns We Trust, there's really two paths in this book, and correct me if I'm wrong. One is the discussion we're having now in terms of the change that the journey evangelicals have been on, how they've changed and are no longer perhaps even Christian, let alone evangelical, in the sense that that word would have meant to say my father in the 1970s, what the word meant. But there's another thing in your book that we don't want to miss, and it's a sort of a 50-50 split, and that is taking the intellectual, philosophical, political presuppositions of this movement and actually examining the truth of them. For instance, just a fact that you debunk in the book, and that is you're safer with a gun in your home. Well, that's not a matter of opinion. That's a matter of statistics. You're much more likely to die if you own a gun for self-defense, whether by suicide or killing your wife, or she kills you, or an accidental death of a child, or when a home invasion occurs, you're pulling your gun out and now you're going to get killed, whereas before you would have just been robbed. This does not work. And so I just want to say that the arguments for guns are debunked in this book as factually and as carefully and as journalistically as I've ever seen. It's worth the price of admission. There's a lot written. The facts are right here, and not like this is my opinion, but this is the study that was done. Here's who did it. Here's the statistical averages they did. So when it comes to gun ownership arguments, you do two things. First of all, you challenge people and say, hey, this is what Jesus said. Okay, fine. That's one thread. But the other thread is you don't even have your facts right.
Yeah.
And that's a thread that is indisputable here. And I've never seen them married in one volume before. So
Yeah.
you've done a tremendous job on that.
Thank you. And I really felt like I needed to do this to pull the curtain back on all of this,
Absolutely.
and to lay bare the evangelical complicity in our gun crisis. Because, why do I say that? I'm not for example, suggesting that evangelicals are shooting the country up. We're not really seeing that. What we're seeing is a few things here. We're seeing that, as you pointed out, evangelicals own way more guns than any other subset of the U.S. population. We also see that white evangelicals play an outsized role in the gun manufacturing industry.
Well, and you name
Uh,
people who own the companies that are making the most deadly weapons, have got
yeah,
Bible verses on their guns and are claiming they're doing it in the name of Christ. And these are
right.
making weapons that blow you apart to the point where you quote a surgeon saying, these are inoperable wounds. These are the most vicious
Yeah,
weapons that have ever been on the market.
yeah, and they've been, there was a company there. It's still a company owned by evangelicals who made the guns used in Uvalde, Texas, to
Yeah,
slaughter all those poor innocents at Robb Elementary School.
yeah,
Our worst, as of this, broadcast, our worst mass shooting in U.S. history
sure.
was the shooting that occurred on the Las Vegas Strip when the shooter up
Yeah,
in the hotel,
yeah,
fired
absolutely.
on.
80 people or
Oh,
whatever killed or
yeah,
something.
right. And this same company, which claims to make AR-15 assault rifles more or less for the glory of God,
Yeah,
manufactured some of those rifles that were
yeah,
used, in that
exactly.
bloodbath. And so there's that, right? So owning more guns than anybody by far, making guns, and especially, these military style weapons, which to my mind don't belong in civilian hands. And then really here's the big push here. Here's the real problem. At 60 million strong, white evangelicals are a potent political force in this
Yeah,
country. And they are, reliably voting for like-minded candidates. And so,
yeah,
you can't get elected to a governor's office or a congressional seat or even a state legislative seat
yeah.
in a red state without the support of evangelicals.
And one of the
And
things you would, sorry, one of the things you address consistently, just to explain your point and why it's so important, is that this same group tend towards an apocalyptic paranoia that's weird because on one hand it's the end times are here and Jesus is coming back, so none of this matters. But on the other hand, it's somehow violence is excused by the fact that these are the end times and everything is going down the drain. And
yeah,
you follow this line of fearfulness that runs through this whole thing. So the people who say they have faith in God to direct our lives and care for us are also the most paranoid, fearful group in America, and they're armed.
right. So exactly. And let me hop on that in a second. Just to complete that last thought, uh, we have evangelicals who are, you know, electing representatives who are blocking access to, or progress on gun restrictions that surveys show most Americans want. Look, more than 80% of us
Sure.
want common sense gun restrictions. We're not talking about disarming Americans here.
Right.
Nobody's coming for your gun. But
Right.
look, could we have universal background checks so that,
Yeah.
you go to a gun show and buy a weapon and you have to have a background check, or a person-to-person private sale?
Mhm.
Right now, that step isn't taken. Uh, or, and then again, a ban on these military style weapons. Most of us want that. And
Yeah.
evangelicals, by propping up these lawmakers who have A ratings from the National Rifle Association, are
Yeah.
essentially standing in the way of the progress that most of us say we want. And
Yeah.
I find that is complicity, right? So,
Absolutely.
then what you just said, it becomes even more troubling when this gun culture is becoming such an article of faith among evangelicals at the very time that
Yeah.
Christian nationalism is ascending. Right? I mean, look, Christian nationalism lives in the White House.
Yeah.
It lives
Absolutely.
in the Capitol. It live, this was a fringe theology 10 years ago, maybe
Yeah.
even 7 or 8 years ago. It was
Yeah.
still a little, and now it's mainstream.
Yeah. And
And
you
and so
talk
I've,
about that. You say by
yeah,
invoking the evilness, is a quote of someone else, by invoking the evilness of humanity, such leaders provide a theological gloss to the guns don't kill people, people kill people argument that has long overshadowed our national conversation about gun violence. And then, you know, in another place, you say, um, the way they disparage and dismiss any other concerns. Black Lives Matter, not particularly all lives matter. Gay rights, straight out of Sodom and Gomorrah. White privilege, not a thing. And stop playing the race card. Gun problem, more like a mental health problem. But then, of course, there, the lie is given to that, because if it is a mental health problem, then let's have background checks.
Yeah, and look, this is a uniquely American scourge.
Yeah,
Again, having lived outside the United States and reported outside the US for many, many years, you just don't see this kind of gun violence anywhere else but in America. Not
yeah,
even in Gaza, for God's sake.
right.
Obviously, it's a combat zone, but person on person, abuse of firearms is not, you don't see
It's
that
not the
there,
same. Yeah,
No.
yeah,
So, this mental health thing is a ruse, right? Because mental health occurs in every society.
yeah.
But, blowing up schools and turning, turning diners and department stores into masses of thrashing wounded. You don't find that everywhere. And
No,
so we talk a lot about American exceptionalism, and we like to
yeah,
think that, oh, we're exceptional. We're very exceptional, just
yeah.
not maybe in the way that we really want to be.
Another thing you follow through here that's really important, I think, to mention, it's sort of a different factor, but just trying to understand where this comes from. The fear factor was never far from my mind when I first believed in the early 1980s. Initially, I thought fear was merely a harmless holdover from our church's uptight elders, those who'd barely navigated the 1970s in plaid polyester with their faith and morals intact, and who had emerged terrified of secular society. But as I embraced evangelicalism, I soon realized its adherents had reduced the culture all around us to a supercharged and singularly menacing term, the world. And of course, I
Yeah.
think that I marked that in the book. I have a note saying important exclamation point, because I think you really put your hand on something there in terms of about 20 rabbit holes we could go down now. And one is the kind of paranoia and fear of the culture. The other is our love of conspiracy theories in the evangelical world, because the world says vaccines are the way to fight disease, but that's the world. We have special information. The world says mass shootings occur because there's a proliferation of guns, but we know it's just evil people and we need more guns. And so, talk a little bit about that, because I think, again, people don't understand that. And your book is brilliant about this. And that it was the number of rabbit holes you go down when you dismiss what I'll just call common sense knowledge. Vaccine saves lives. Guns in homes are dangerous. Um, it's not just that evangelicalism rejects some of this, it's that we evangelicals are groomed from birth to not accept what, at face value, I think it's fair enough to call normal explanations of reality. And that goes for evolution, that goes for gun rights, that goes for vaccines, that goes for, sexual attraction and so forth. So every time that the evangelical world goes up against the world, here's the last rabbit hole and the biggest ones. They see themselves as victims who must defend themselves with firearms, because the world is so far off our chart that sooner or later they're going to come for us, or they're going to take our children, or they're going to, whatever. So just get into that, because I'd say, of 4 or 5 big things in your book, this is sort of the heart of one of your arguments.
It is the heart. It really is the heart of the whole book, this fear factor. It's what motivates, gun sales. I mean, people
Yes.
are afraid, so they buy a
Yeah.
gun, right?
Yeah.
And there is this sort of mystifying fear, I almost paranoia.
Yes,
I don't quite
absolutely.
get it. Again, we're talking about a cohort of people that's 60 million strong.
Yeah.
And these are white folks, okay?
And
So
very
look, without
male
putting
too, by the way. Very
very,
male.
very male, yeah, for sure. But look, so they're white, they're male. They
They're
arguably have more
scared,
privilege.
and they're
Yeah, but
scared.
they have more privilege than anybody else in the country. So what
Right.
are they scared of?
Yeah,
I mean, they've
exactly.
got it. This is what we could talk about this a little later, because part of my argument in concluding the book is we can't really solve this problem unless we engage with evangelicals.
Yeah,
And one
absolutely.
way to do that is just to ask them, have thoughtful conversation. What are you really afraid of?
Yeah,
Because look, we're seeing fear manipulated at the highest levers of power. The White House and President Trump are, capitalizing on people's fears and distorting reality. I mean, the crime is down in American cities, but
yeah,
he's sending the National Guard
yeah,
into our great cities, and we don't need it, because crime is down, and certainly
yeah,
violent crime.
yeah,
So there's this false narrative and a lot of mythology that supercharges this whole gun thing.
yeah.
You
And
know,
I would just say
and
there's one element.
including
Yeah, one element that's new to both of us in terms of our recent lives, and that is this kind of algorithmic trajectory that drives us further into rabbit holes in which there are no other opinions because there's billionaires in Silicon Valley making money out of the fact that people are only reading opinions that further enrage them and that they'll click on.
Yeah, that's right. And if you have a different thought, it gets suppressed by the algorithm, and not very few people see your differing opinion. So it's not a great situation. Look, there's so much mythology here. This idea that a good guy with a gun is needed to subdue the bad guy with a gun. Such a persistent narrative, and one that's dearly held by evangelicals,
Yeah,
because there is this ethos, right? And you know it, Frank, from growing up, in
sure.
that tribe,
Yeah,
that's this sort of, it's very patriarchal as well, this idea that I must care for my family, a noble thing. I want to,
yeah,
who doesn't want to care for their family? But
yeah,
do we need to do it with a AR-15?
yeah,
But this has been uh, distorted into something otherworldly and
yeah.
something completely, from a Christian point of view, unbiblical. I
Well,
mean, where you
also unfactual. And just to go, I was saying there's this strain, several strains that run through your book, and one is just to challenge some of their lack of grounding when it comes to facts and things like self-defense. But numerous studies have shown that although a well-trained, highly skilled, cool-headed everyman with a gun does occasionally manage to avert greater loss of life, it happens far, far less frequently than the NRA would have you think. Harvard University researchers who analyzed data from the National Crime Victimization Survey spanning 2007 to 2011 concluded that gun owners managed to successfully defend themselves, and this is sort of great, in fewer than 1% of crimes. Another study found that the percentage of people who use their gun in self-defense is similar to the number of Americans who claim they've been abducted by aliens, about 3%. Quote, self-defense gun use is a rare event, concludes David Hemenway, lead author of the Harvard study. You have a lot of these things, but basically anytime you drill down in the facts, the kind of hyperbole and fiction of the NRA and so forth is very hollow. It's not just propagandistic, it's often completely lied based. It's just not
yeah.
related to fact.
Right. Yeah. Well, I attended a number of gun shows while I was researching and
Yeah.
reporting the book. I even joined the NRA. I've got
Yeah, I
my
know. I
my
saw that.
card in my wallet. I had to run out once, Frank, and meet my mailman and explain to him because he was bringing all this NRA
Yeah.
propaganda mail to my house, and I was afraid he was taking a very dim view of me, and I had to explain my project. But yeah, there's a lot of they traffic in fear. The
Yeah,
NRA
and of course,
traffics
and a lot
heavily
of
in
the
fear.
hierarchy have done this. Before he resigned as president of Liberty University in the aftermath of a tabloid sex scandal, Jerry Falwell Jr., whose televangelist father founded what has become the largest private nonprofit university in the United States, but a 3 million gun range on the Lynchburg, Virginia campus. The younger Falwell, who himself has taken to carrying a handgun around, invoked Islamic terrorism and urged Liberty students to get their concealed carry permits so they can, quote, end those Muslims. So, when you look at that reaction, it related to the facts that you have in terms of how guns are unsuccessful when it comes to self-defense, you look at the real studies. But in addition to which, of course, with the anti-immigration push and the kind of paranoia that comes, in so much evangelical packaging these days in terms of the other, the invader, the alien, um, it's no wonder that Donald Trump plays this up. But of course, what he's doing is very similar to what other leaders who have been an oligarchical kind of corrupt systems that he's imitating and copying from, like Vladimir Putin, for instance.
Yeah.
They do the same things everywhere. So you're not saying, hey, this is unique to America. This is the playbook. Uh, Play
It's
on
the playbook.
fears, hate your enemy.
Yeah. And so again, let's look at the facts. You mentioned Islamic terrorism. Well,
Right,
here's an interesting statistic. At the top, we talked about how 41% of evangelicals own a firearm. There are actual other studies, another study that said that 54% own firearms. And there's something called the World Christian Database, which is
right.
assembled here in Massachusetts at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, uh, which takes a deep and serious dive into many sociological aspects of Christianity. And the woman who compiles that believes that there is closer to 65% of
Yeah.
white evangelicals who own a
And
gun. But
yeah,
let's compare that to other faith traditions, right? So Muslims in this country, 1 in 10 Muslims owns a gun. We revile and demonize Islam in the United
sure.
States, but only 10% of those folks are arming themselves
Yeah.
compared to 65% of white evangelicals. So
Yeah.
who's really the threat here?
Well, or look at just a blunt statistic. How many gun deaths there are a year compared to how many people died in the Twin Towers in 9/11?
Right, exactly.
I mean,
Right,
if you need to name your enemy and do something about it, the Twin Towers event was nothing compared to the number of gun deaths every year that we find perfectly tolerable
right, exactly. Yeah.
in this whole thing. I just want to go to something here I found very interesting. In the chapter 5 here, the fear factor, you can see I've written all over the page.
I love
um,
it. I love it.
Yeah, that's
You're-
me. Heads up, evangelicals. They're coming for you. They're coming for your Bibles. They're coming for your guns. They're coming for your children. They're coming for your freedoms. They're coming for your very way of life. This is a myth, of course. White evangelicals are arguably the most privileged class in America, with influence and political clout that many truly vulnerable segments of society, think communities of color, the marginalized rural poor, and the embattled LGBTQ plus population can only dream of. And yet it persists, driving the narrative around the supposed need to be armed for self-protection, or in the darker and more extreme rationalization, for overthrowing the government. So that's an interesting transition from the paranoid fantasy into their final argument is that the guns are not just for home protection, they are here in case we need a second American Revolution so we can overthrow the government.
yeah.
And of course, that impetus carries into real politics in terms of challenging the veracity of election results, storming the Capitol. Um, this. So we have seen the first steps in the direction of implementing some of that. Um, and you look at our future and you wonder what happens with political violence when it's sold to people as standing up for Christian America, which is the sort of heart of the Christian nationalist idea that they're coming for you, but now we're armed. And of course, practically speaking, again, my son was a Marine and fought in Afghanistan, and you have all these little armed camps and people, but if they went up against the kind of people who were in Afghanistan with my son, they would lose. So, this fantasy that we're somehow going to push back against the U.S. government is
Well,
a
yeah.
little bit fictitious. But
No,
that
again,
said, that level of paranoia is now getting into the talk of not just armed insurrection, but of kind of a revolutionary movement that is going to fight for these rights that are being taken away by them, never specific who they are. Just go to that transition. It's not just self-defense. It's not your wife and your family you're defending. It's a political statement. I own all these weapons of mass destruction. And what is the final purpose for that? In
right.
this evangelical male white mindset.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There is this ideology that I have to be armed to protect my nation and my way of life. Superimposed over all of that, by the way, is a very, very supercharged, religiously charged view of the Second Amendment, which is viewed by evangelicals as holy scripture. All right,
Yeah,
so like it's not just a line in the Constitution. It's like the Word of God,
yeah,
and so they carry that uh, mindset into this notion of I have to have my weapons at the ready in case I need to use them. And now sociologists regularly check in with different groups of people, including, religious segments of our society, and ask them, how likely do you feel that that you're ready to use your weapon, against the government or
Yeah,
against authority? White evangelicals are way, way, way up at the top of the charts when
sure.
it comes to that readiness,
Yeah,
And again, so that's dangerous because that could, we could have all kinds of showdowns with, and already have, over history with,
sure.
with law enforcement, thinking about, Waco, Branch Davidians, all kinds of other groups.
Yeah,
But look, honestly, even if everybody goes out today and buys an AR-15 military style assault rifle,
sure.
the U.S. government has nukes
Yeah,
and
that's right.
and attack helicopters and submarines and tanks and drones and
Yeah.
I mean, do you really think that you're going to subdue the Pentagon with
Yeah, and
your
who exactly
AR?
would it's so funny because you see all this rhetoric, anti-government rhetoric, and I'm 73 years old. My latest sort of encounters with the US government is going up to Haverhill to a very lovely regional social security office and talking to a wonderful black woman who helped me through the paperwork, and got my payments going, and people you can call when you're on Medicare. And the one time I was audited 30 years ago by the IRS because we had just moved from Switzerland as a missionary kid, and it was like, oh, you're from Switzerland, how polite they were. And then my son, who was a Marine, and I wrote this bestseller with him, Keeping Faith, a Father-Son Story about Love in the United States Marine Corps. And I spent a lot of time on Paris Island afterwards researching the book with the full blessing of the Marine Corps. And, these guys are being trained not to commit crimes in war, and they're very disciplined. And the crazy thing is, all the guns are locked away in the armory. The recruits who are going to be Marines and fight for us aren't allowed to touch these weapons, let alone march around with them loaded ever. If some Marine recruit walked out with a loaded firearm, they would be dishonorably discharged from the Marine Corps after spending some time in jail because it's
Yeah,
against the thing. So the funny thing is, having had a son in the Marine Corps, which is a killing machine and does it officially for a reason, and all my connection with the U.S. Marine Corps, to see them as a threat, in terms of like, yep, they're going to march in here and take my children and teach them to be atheists or whatever it is. The ludicrousness of this in this culture. And like you, I've traveled. I lived in South Africa for a year. I grew up in Europe. Americans don't have any idea how ludicrous this is in the American context. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about the mentality that you found out there joining the NRA and all this other stuff.
sure.
What sort of a world do the people who own the guns and think they've got to protect themselves against the US government, what do they picture? To me, the US government is my local cop who patrols our neighborhood once in a while, the Social Security office in Haverhill, a couple people out there. I got to file my taxes. What are they picturing in reality when they go to these crazy fantasies? What do they see?
There's so much Christian nationalism, and fear is whipped up within faith communities that there again is it's a complete distortion of reality. And I quote in the book a comedian. His name is escaping me right now. Who says, basically using the voice of an evangelical,
Right.
don't get me wrong. I support the troops. I just want to be ready to kill as many of them as possible if I have
Exactly.
to. I mean, which
Yeah.
is right. But that's sort of that really lays bare this kind of schizophrenia that exists, quite frankly, in
Yeah, and as the
evangelical
father of a
Christianity.
Marine who was proud of his service, I sort of take that personally. My son John is the US government as it projects its strength,
Yeah.
and he's not marching into anybody's neighborhood and never would have because he took an
No,
oath not to. The nearest we've gotten to that is the troops Trump sending into our neighborhoods, the
right.
militarization of our cities by this right-wing guy. I want to skip to something here. Normalizing guns in religious life results in meaningless legislative diversions instead of practical action when gun violence erupts. Sociologist Andrew Whitehead said. He notes that after the 2018 Parkland school shooting that killed 17 students and staff, lawmakers in Florida, rather than tightening easy access to guns, passed a bill requiring the motto, "In God We Trust," to be posted prominently at public schools as a supposed deterrent. Neighboring Alabama and Louisiana since have done something similar with the Ten Commandments, raising concerns about church state separation. So there's these sort of meaningless actions. But then, in addition to that, you talk about Texas, for instance, and other states who, in reaction to mass killings, loosen the gun laws.
Oh, it's not even, and honestly, it's a national trend. So we
Yeah.
had again the Uvalde, Texas school massacre in
Yeah.
2022. Since 2022, state legislatures, plural, across the United States have passed more laws expanding access to guns than restricting access to guns.
Yeah.
So, talk about going in the wrong direction here,
Yeah.
Look, the fundamental truth here, and if we're not ready to face it yet, I don't know when we will,
Yeah.
is the answer to our gun crisis is not more guns, right? I
Right.
mean, we have so many guns in the United States, Frank. We don't even we can't even count them
Right.
properly. We know that we have north of 400 million.
Right.
And you lived in Switzerland. That's where the Small Arms Survey is based, and they do very serious work
That's right.
of trying to quantify this around the world. And their most recent count shows that in the United States we have 120 firearms for every 100 citizens,
People. Yeah.
which is more than double the next country on the list, which is the Falkland Islands, which has
Yeah.
62 weapons for every 100 citizens. So, we are awash in weapons. And there's just no way, this cockamamie argument about guns don't kill people, people kill people,
Yeah.
just sort of collapses on itself when you realize that guns are in such easy reach.
Yeah. Of course.
And that's what makes us different from other countries.
Well, and like I said at the beginning, when you look at Kirk being shot, the one thing I don't hear J.D. Vance say is, why did a guy like this get a gun? And how did he get it? I mean, they don't ask the obvious question. Same when somebody took a shot at Trump. So, we ask everything but the relevant question, studiously avoided. In conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is William J. Kole. William is a veteran journalist, and we've been talking to him about a terrific book that's going to be in our book club in January. And I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I marked it thoroughly in Guns We Trust. And what the argument of this book is twofold. It's one, looking at the evangelical white Christian community predominantly that now puts gun ownership and the Second Amendment right up there with the parables of Jesus Christ and the Sermon on the Mount in a weird, kind of horrible, odd way. The other thing that this book does is completely debunk the facts, if you want to put them that way, of right-wing gun ownership, in the sense of just looking at the actual numbers of how many people are killed in houses by people invading the home as opposed to a guy shooting his wife, and what really happens. So I would ask you, if you're watching this In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, to please subscribe right now on YouTube, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, It Has to Be Said commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And you can also follow my new project that launches November 1, thegospelofzit.com, which is a book being put for free, no strings attached, online on YouTube for everyone November 1st, with me reading it, and then also is for sale on Amazon, etc. So to get back to your book here for a minute, I want to talk about something you say here. Do 21st century Christians really believe Christ would holster a Glock beneath his tunic or conceal an AR-15 within the folds of his robe? Too many may answer yes, but I can't buy that. So the let me put it this way: the absurdity of even needing to write that sentence,
I know.
is sort of like saying, it would be saying, can you be a good Jew and believe that the Holocaust never happened? I mean, it's like total opposites, oxymoron. So I just want to go back to something we mentioned briefly, but let's discuss a little bit just sort of this fascination with what I'll call rolling apocalypses that dog all of Christian history. It's not just the US. If you go to the year 1000, you had every Christian group waiting for the year 1000 years after Christ to be the end of everything, because it was going to be a significant year. And then it didn't happen. And then a group of theologians stepped forth in the year 1001 and said, well, it didn't happen because Jesus died when he was 32 or whatever his age was. So it'll be 32 years from now. It's 1032. It's not exactly from the date of his birth. Whatever. They had another reason. When I was a little boy growing up in Lebris, Switzerland, Hal Lindsey came with his Great Late Planet Earth, and then I knew Beverly LaHaye and all of those guys. And now you have Peter Thiel to go totally the other direction, saying we're in the time of the Antichrist. And it shows that, we need to be pro technology and AI and all this stuff. Um, this has been part and parcel of evangelical belief, also somewhat plagues the Islamic community with their own end times visions. Um, Someone like myself who's lived through all these iterations that didn't happen says enough, I'm done looking with this. And I call myself an atheist who prays, but just talk about how that panicked apocalyptic hysteria is part of what you're talking about right here in Guns We Trust, because this is almost inexplicable without that. You have to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and this is a thread that runs through evangelical Christianity. And again, we've talked about some of the themes that
Yeah.
sort of prop it up. The fear, the persecution complex, that is very present in evangelical communities. Uh, I would say because people are arming themselves at such a great rate. Um, Many evangelicals, by the way, own more than one firearm. It's
Oh
not just the
yeah,
one,
absolutely.
they could, some I know personally have small armories.
Yeah.
And look, I think if you start arming yourself like that and you have this us versus them default mindset,
Yeah.
you're in danger of creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean,
Yeah.
if you're trying to guard against and defend against Armageddon, when you're kind of hastening, a very ugly showdown with the
Sure.
rest of the culture. And I find this really fraught and deeply, deeply troubling to me.
Yeah.
And
Speaking of mental illness, actually, there might be
yeah,
a little self-analysis there, because who's the crazy person in this picture? The guy with, 20 guns and a bunker in his yard. At a certain point, this is not a vision of life that you want in your neighborhood. Um,
right.
this is
Yeah.
not who you want next door.
Right. And I do want to just circle back to the suicide issue because that really is by the huge lion's share of gun deaths are suicides. And so
Yeah.
we are preoccupied rightly with mass shootings and.
Sure.
But this is, we're running around 47,000 gun deaths in the US per
Yeah.
year. And a good 27,000 of those are suicides. So
Yeah.
again, when I try and engage with my evangelical friends, I try and appeal to their sort of baked in sense of being pro-life, of
Yeah.
upholding the sanctity of life. And I
Yeah.
and the argument is it's pretty basic. If you really say that you value life, what about folks who, are taking their own lives readily because they have such easy access to a gun?
Yeah, and one thread in your book that is excellent, and I'm going to ask you to just go into here for a second. I mean, I have all the quotes here marked, but let's just talk about it for a second. I don't need to read another passage out. Is this business about not just gun ownership and suicide and all the rest of it, but this whole idea of packing firearms in church, all these guys going to church with guns, and not to mention the shooting range at the back of a church or whatever it may be. So all of a sudden, it's not only God blesses guns and the Second Amendment is right up there with the Ten Commandments, but now, I'm packing a weapon in church. And I can only imagine being raised in a family that's doing that. I mean, what is the message this sends to someone? I took my children to church and my grandchildren to church, and this is sort of on my own way out of the evangelical world. But they never saw me holster a concealed weapon to go to church. And when you talk about sort of a counterintuitive or a contradiction of anything that you would hold dear, um, by the way, juxtaposed with the idea that you can't go to a gun show with a concealed weapon. You got to leave your
Yeah,
weapon at the door.
you got to leave it at the door, which a lot of people don't understand and realize, right? So but you can walk right into a church. This is actually the genesis of In Guns We Trust. I mean,
Yeah,
again, I was a mega church worship leader
yeah,
when my bass player showed up for rehearsal with a 9 millimeter Sig Sauer semi-automatic handgun.
yeah,
And it startled the hell out of me. I have really. I mean, I didn't. I was speechless. And
yeah,
when I finally regained my composure, I basically asked him, why did you bring this? I mean, we're singing, about peace and grace and mercy, and you've got this killing tool strapped to your chest. I mean,
Yeah,
what is
exactly.
that?
Yeah,
And that really opened my eye. But up to then, Frank, I didn't know that so many evangelicals carried,
yeah.
weapons, and I soon realized that many in my church did so. And the pastor owned a gun that he kept at home
Well,
to
and now
defend
in
his family.
Florida, they've got open carry laws so that, you're taking your kid to church and there's somebody with an AR on his
Yeah.
back with not,
So this whole
fully loaded, ready to roll.
which is incredible. And I mean, that's very jarring, by the way, to walk down the street and see somebody with a military style weapon slung over their shoulder. Right? Not
It
doesn't
is.
exactly inspire confidence.
No, and again,
Uh,
just as the father of a Marine, if you tried that on a U.S. Marine barracks, you would be in jail. They
you'd
would
be
arrest you and
court-martialed.
put you away. You'd
Yeah.
be court-martialed. You can't
Yeah.
carry a weapon on a military base that's
Well, there
loaded
are
unless
rules
you're
of engagement, and
well,
there are rules
unless
of
you're a guard at the gate.
right.
Nobody on the base is allowed to carry a loaded weapon ever.
Right.
Which is sort of odd. I remember somebody interviewing Tucker Carlson saying they were surprised because he came to the interview in his own living room with a sidearm, strapped in his house.
Yeah.
So, if I
Yeah.
invite you for dinner and I walk in with a sidearm, to serve you a cup of coffee, I think you have a right to ask questions in terms of my own mental, ability, especially if you walk through my nice neighborhood and talk to my neighbors, like, who exactly am I scared of?
Right. Yeah.
And why would I carry a loaded weapon in my home? Um,
It, and
and
there's
so
again,
forth.
there's such a huge disconnect here. I think uh, even among people of faith, look, fear is the antithesis of faith, right?
Yeah,
I mean, really, if you boil, you can't
absolutely.
you can't have faith in something and be fearful. I mean, if they just don't go together,
Well,
right?
and
So
they
I
don't
mean,
even go together in this sort of a practical folklore of evangelicalism.
right?
I grew up in a home, we weren't Pentecostal Christians. We didn't believe in healing, but we did believe in anointing, laying on of hands. You prayed to God. You
Yeah,
prayed to Jesus if you had cancer
yeah.
to help you. But apparently, prayer doesn't work when it comes to the neighbors who are about to attack your house because you're a Christian, or whatever the paranoia is. So the whole evangelical thing is being denied because you're supposed to trust in God for protection. You're supposed to trust in God for even your daily bread and whatever comes down. But when it comes to this, you're packing a firearm in church.
I even in the book, in one passing, reference, I talk about this a little bit, and I broach the subject of a good death.
Yeah.
Is there such a thing as a good death? I mean,
Yeah.
again, this will make people squirm. It even makes me squirm to talk
Right.
about it a little bit
Right.
because I don't want to die. My first book was about living to 100, and how
Yeah.
more of us are doing that.
Yeah.
I'd like to be 100.
Yeah.
I don't want to die, and but I'm not willing to answer any remote threat of gun violence by carrying a gun myself.
Right.
And if honest to God, if I were in church, I'm currently not attending because I'm really kind of trying to figure out what I believe right
Sure.
now. But if I were in church, uh, and I was dispatched into eternity by some crazy gunman who walked in, I'm there worshiping. I'm at peace with myself.
Right.
I'm in a certain state of bliss and
Right.
all the rest of it. I would characterize that as a good death.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
I'm not going to do is walk around like like some kind of a vigilante, ready allegedly to end a situation like that, which hardly ever happens. It
And
just
with numbers of crimes going down, this kind of false picture this gives our
yeah,
children and grandchildren. I mean, I try to teach my children and grandchildren to be fearless. I don't mean be stupid, but I'm teaching my grandson. We rebuilt our barn together during COVID, and he knows how to use a table saw without cutting his hand off. But we don't, risk aversion is not the first lesson I pass on to him. Here are our guns, learn to shoot. Because if you hear a knock on the door and you don't know who it is, let's just open fire before you can see who they are, because you never know. I mean, that's
right.
not the way any sensible parent or grandparent raises a child. We live in a fear, especially in a day and age when crime is going down. And compared to the rest of the world, we're relatively safe, except for people carrying guns.
Right.
In this
Yeah,
crazy culture
exactly.
of ours, it's so counterintuitive. and all the good parenting stuff, all these good homeschoolers, everything they believe in terms of passing on values. Character used to be the thing until it wasn't. After we elected Trump, now character is not a thing anymore. You can be accused of rape and run for president or bitcoins and all this stuff. The evangelical movement has slid so far into this kind of odd twilight zone that
Yeah.
this is just part of it. But
Oh,
the thing
yes.
about your book is it's such a contradiction of what evangelicals used to say they believed. I
That's
mean,
right.
none of our great awakenings or great revivals resulted in massive new waves of gun ownership. So all the people that they think back on as spiritual leaders, Whitfield, Wesley, all these guys, this was never the result.
Right.
And you talk about Billy Graham kind of stoking the paranoia of anti-communism and Nixon and so forth. But when people committed their life to Christ at a Billy Graham rally, they didn't leave with the impression the next thing I do is buy an AR-15 to deal
Right.
with those liberals or my Jewish neighbors. That wasn't part of the package in the follow-up materials. It was find a good church and go there.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think this goes even further into a realm that is also kind of depressing and troubling, and that is evangelicals are um, distancing themselves from the social issues of the day in a way that
Yeah,
I find unchristian. So I
yeah,
mean, I think the very fact that I wrote this book and that I'm trying to address this social ill has
yeah,
put me on blacklist as far as some of my evangelical friends. The fact that I care about LGBTQ people,
right.
that I care about migrants. Now I'm a Marxist,
Yeah,
to
now
them,
you're a
right?
Marxist.
I'm a
Well, hey,
Marxist. I'm not
if you
I'm not a Christian anymore,
and of course, if you even
apparently.
bring any of this stuff up, now that's defined as hate speech because it's not exactly what Donald Trump wants you to be saying.
Right. Yeah. So it's really baffling to me. And again, I keep coming back to this word betrayal because
Yeah,
when I first believed, I grew up, I was, baptized Catholic and then grew up in an agnostic household.
sure,
We never attended church. Honestly, I was in university and I still wasn't really completely sure who Jesus Christ was.
sure.
That's how distant I was from faith stuff. And when I fell into evangelical Christianity, I really was charmed by this sort of purity and joy and
Yeah,
camaraderie. And now these things have just been supplanted by hostility and anger and hatred.
yeah,
I really don't recognize it anymore.
yeah. It's not the same thing. I mean, some
No.
creep hands you a gun when you sign up for Jesus. This is not what you signed up for.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, listen, In Guns We Trust, we're going to be offering it as our January book club. We'd put it in sooner, except our book club roster is pretty full now. But um, I highly recommend this to anybody who wants to do one of several things. One, if you want to read a fact-based um, exploration of what guns really do in terms of numbers of how people die and don't die and get defended and all the rest of it. This is a book. So it's got all that information in it, but also within it is, I think, the best argument that's been made in a very dispassionate, fact-based way that's easy to read and doesn't smack of anything propagandistic. You can finish this book and still vote for Republicans, if I could put it that way. But what you can't do is finish this book and say, evangelicals carrying weapons into churches is normal and good. And this is what Christianity's always been. So at the very least, anybody who reads in God, in Guns We Trust is going to go away saying something really fundamental has changed in the American Christian idea. And the fact that we're in the middle of a presidency that has sort of played to all these worst instincts just makes it more poignant and so forth. So listen, before I go, I have a favor to ask you. Um, and it has nothing to do with selling my book. So relax. It has to do with the fact that I'm going to sign off here in a minute. But after I do, would you stay on for a few minutes and talk to my producer Ernie?
Sure.
Because Ernie Gregg gets some of our best names for more guests from our guests. Um, Having just discussed your book with me, maybe you think of someone who we should be interviewing or who might enjoy talking to me.
I know just the
So
person. Yep.
well, please tell Ernie about it. And then the other thing is, before I sign off, is just to thank you so much for writing this book and to say that anytime you want to communicate anything to the three people who watch me besides Ernie, um, Sometimes it's more than that. Please contact Ernie and just say, hey, I'd really like to do another, have Frank interview me, and just fill in the blank, because you're welcome back anytime. This has been great. And we really want to help this book thrive, because this is really important.
Thank you so much for your support and for engaging with me around this essential issue. I
Yeah.
really, I'm really, really thankful.
Yeah, me too. I mean, there's all sorts of things we do, and some are actual life and death, and this is actually life and death because guns really do kill people. So thank you for writing the book. Please stick around and talk to Ernie, and this has been just such a pleasure and a privilege.